In the last lecture module, we looked at these two arguments, the argument from design, or the teleological argument, and the argument from natural law. And I suggested that these arguments are really sort of two versions of the same kind of argument. They both make observations about the orderly, intricate structure of the natural world. They then make an analogy between that order and structure and the order and structure of codes of conduct or of artifacts. And then they make an inference, since the artifacts, the codes of conduct, have their cause in intelligent choice on the part of humans, then the order and structure that we find in the world, it too must have a cause in the choices of an intelligent designer, i.e. a God. Now we want to look at concerns that philosophers and theologians have had about these arguments. And the teleological argument in particular was popular, as I noted, during the 18th century. And two philosophers, Immanuel Kant and David Hume, wrote extensive critical commentaries on these arguments. And Russell's responses sort of mirrors some of the difficulties that they found in these arguments. So the first point that Russell brings up is both of these arguments turn on this analogy between artifacts and structure in the natural world, between codes of conduct and their causes, and law-like relationships in the way that the world unfolds and its cause. But this analogy, in order to support an inference to a designer, a creator, a lawgiver, it has to be a pretty strong analogy. And Russell on page 57, in talking about the argument from natural law, he tells us human laws are behests commanding you to believe in a certain way, in which way you may choose to believe, or you may choose not to believe. But natural laws are descriptions of how things do in fact behave. So he's pointing to what he thinks is a disanalogy between, in this case, laws that we use to describe the functioning, the evolution of phenomena in the natural world, and laws that we use to regulate human interactions within society. And he said these aren't the same kinds of things. Physical laws are descriptions about how the world works. There is no optional component to it. There is no normative force behind them. They are just descriptions of how things unfold. Human laws are, in fact, normative in nature. They are codes that you could choose to behave in accordance with, or you could choose not to behave in accordance with. But they have this normative force, this pull that says you should behave this way, and there's nothing like that. Billiard balls, they don't have a choice about how they behave. They're not criticized for not behaving in particular ways. They behave as they do. And it's the analysis of this analogical relationship between features of the natural world and features of artifacts or of codes of conduct, of things that involve intelligent choice, that is one of the criticisms that emerge regarding the teleological argument. And in fact, right, even if you go with this analogy, there's still difficulties that emerge, even if you think the analogy is sufficient to support the inference. It's not clear that the explanations that these arguments purport to offer of the natural phenomenon, by reference to the choices of intelligent designers or intelligent lawgivers, right, whether or not those explanations really work to explain anything. So whenever you make an explanation by appealing to the choice of a rational agent, then you pretty much invoke a situation where the principle of sufficient reason seems to definitely apply. So why did you do that, Bill? I did it because of X, Y, and Z. People do things for reasons. And in fact, if someone does something for no reason, we think that it's not an intelligent choice. And so when you try to explain features of the world by reference to the choice of a designer or a lawgiver, the natural question is, why this choice and not another choice? Why these laws and not other laws? And in order to answer that question, you end up in the same situation that we saw, and we'll see again, with the Euthyphro dilemma. This idea that either the choice looks arbitrary and hence doesn't seem to explain why these laws, or the choice looks like it was guided by some objective reality and hence it's not clear why the designer or lawgiver is invoked at all. And so when you think about why it is that we have the laws that we do, why it is that we have the order that we do, one of the objections that people bring up is an objection that we see Russell talking about. So Russell says, look, why these laws? Well, either God had a reason for these laws as opposed to others, or God didn't. Either God said, yes, principle of universal gravitational attraction, or God said something else. All right? If God didn't have any reasons, then positing God as an explanation for the law of universal gravitation doesn't actually explain why it is a law. So in the same way that, positing God as the designer of, say, the human eye doesn't actually explain why the eye is the way it is. If you say, well, why is it, for instance, that the photosensitive cells are all pointing towards the back of your eye, in your eye, and not towards the front where the light's coming from? And they say, that's just the way it was. God didn't have any reason for that. Then it doesn't look like positing God explains that choice. On the other hand, Russell says, if God had reasons, then it looks like God, to quote him, was subject to law, and therefore you don't get any explanatory advantage by introducing God as an intermediary. So why these laws? Well, God chose these laws. Why did God choose these laws? Well, because there's these objective reasons. Well, then, why do we suppose that the reasons themselves aren't enough for the laws to be the way they are? Why suppose that there has to be a creator now? Why not a lawgiver or a designer? Why not just suppose they came about the way that they did? And this is precisely why evolution was so troubling to people when it emerged as a scientific theory, because it purports to explain all of these phenomena that people thought you needed a designer to explain in a way that doesn't require a designer, that appeals to objective physical facts, and hence makes a designer seemingly superfluous. Now, the final thing that Russell doesn't really mention, but is important, is whether or not the world really conforms to these kinds of descriptions. So, if in fact you find that laws aren't exceptionless, that there are all sorts of exceptions to laws, and in fact the law of universal gravitation is in fact supplanted by general and special relativity. If you find things like the bunny's digestive tract or the panda's thumbs, where it doesn't look like the way the world worked out really calls for some intelligent choice, then again, this analogy seems to break down. In order for you to need a designer or a lawgiver, it has to be the case that these things really do strongly resemble artifacts or codes of conduct. And insofar as they don't, it undermines the force of the argument.